Since the beginning of this war, almost 11 months ago, Hamas has been playing pretty much the same game. One of its strategies is how do we survive? How does it not be defeated and eliminated by the IDF on the battlefield? How does its rule and control over Gaza not be put to an end and be replaced by a new actor, either put into place by Israel, the Americans, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Saudis? And one of the ways that it does this is by pulling at the emotional strings of Israelis. And it has done this very effectively over the last 11 months. The way it releases hostage videos, the way it, ahead of holidays, ahead of the Passover holiday, ahead of the Independence Day holiday, Israel's Independence Day, the way it did this again after murdering six people, six Israeli Jews who were being held in a tunnel somewhere dark inside the southern Gaza Strip. Their bodies recovered by Israel on Saturday, brought to rest on Sunday and Monday. And then after the funerals, to then release their last recorded statements, their wishes and their dispatch of love to their families is just cruel, cynical, and is meant to further rip at our hearts. And they do this also because they know that it is effective. They know that this is what will spark riots and protests and will get Israelis to come out even more harsher against their government. And this has been working for them. And I think that we could say, no, Israelis need to be stronger. Israelis need to be more resilient. Israelis need to stand up to this. But I think we also have to recognize Israelis are human beings. And Israelis are emotional human beings like all people around this world who value life and cherish their loved ones. And therefore, when we see this, it pains us. Unlike them, Hamas, they sanctify death. And that is why there will always be this great sea gap between us.
That makes it more difficult to fight if one side plays by different rules. But beyond that, you mentioned timing in your analysis of Hamas's propaganda. How upset are Israelis by the timing of the UK's decision to curb arms sales that was also announced during the funerals of the six hostages?
Look, the UK announcement when it comes to arms sales, on the one hand, okay, this is politics and there are considerations, and this is a new government that is now led by Labour. And of course, they're going to be a little more left wing and more progressive and more liberal. And the Gaza war was always going to be something of controversy. But the timing of it, to make this announcement pretty much as Hersh Goldberg Poland, the Israeli-American hostage who had become a symbol worldwide, whose parents Rachel and John, were literally Superman and Superwoman and Supermom and Superdad, what they did around the world, knocking on every door, banging down every door to advance the cause and the release of their son, who was murdered, but also of the other 100+ hostages who are still being held in Gaza. And to do it then and to make that announcement then just shows a callousness and a total lack of awareness and understanding and recognition of what it is that Israel is facing. Now, you want to make your political decisions, go ahead. I have issues with them. I think you're wrong. I think they're mistaken. But what message is the UK government sending to the world when it says that on a day like today, when it's so obvious to everyone who is the enemy that Israel is fighting against, that it is issuing that announcement on that exact time?
There has been some announcement this morning by the IDF that it has eliminated Ahmed Wadiyya, the commander of the Nukba company and the Daraj Tufa battalion, a member of Hamas's paragliding unit. Clearly, the Israeli Air Force and the IDF are still carrying out significant operations. What is the current strategy, do you think, in Gaza right now?
Let's remember who we're dealing with. Ahmed Wadiyya, who is the commander of the Nukhba force, this was the Hamas elite force that raided the Nativ Asara kibbutz, and was part of the paragliding commanders, one of the senior commanders. But I want to point out one other thing of who he was, because I think it really tells the story. He was filmed standing and drinking Coke in front of the kids of Koren and Shai Katha, a couple, young Israeli couple, little children. Their father, Shai, had jumped on a grenade to sacrifice himself to save his children. This was the man who, in that house, after the father had been murdered, was lying on the floor dead, stood there nonchalantly drinking Coke. This is the enemy we're facing against. So again, just what we were talking about before, a little awareness and understanding. What it also shows, though, is without a doubt the fact that this war does continue, and there are enemies and combatants that still need to be removed and eliminated. This is something that will go on. Israel is still pursuing a victory over Hamas, which will see the elimination and the continued degrading of Hamas's capabilities. And it just goes to underscore and show that this war is far from being over still, right? As much as Israel has had success, and it has had success, and as much as the tragedy is for the people of Gaza, and there is a tragedy for the people of Gaza, but as long as Hamas still has capabilities and still is in control of Gaza, the war does still need to continue.
And when you have a terror group committing such heinous atrocities like this, it's not a stretch to imagine that the same group might lie when it comes to negotiations for a ceasefire and who is to blame for the failing of any talks. Where do you see the negotiations right now, and how significant is this debate over what is known as the Philadelphia corridor, where arms have historically been smuggled in to Hamas terrorists?
Israel faces a real dilemma, and I think it's not simple. What we saw on Saturday when those 6 hostages' bodies were discovered was just a day after, pretty much a day and a half after the Israeli cabinet had held a vote and the members had overwhelmingly voted to decide that Israel cannot leave the Philadelphia corridor, that strip of land between Gaza and Egypt where Hamas has its tunnels, as long, even under a hostage deal, and that Israel needs to retain a presence there for we don't know how long, but to prevent Hamas from reopening those tunnels, redigging those tunnels, and recreating the oxygen pipeline of Iranian weapons into Gaza. You saw right away after, tragically, how I don't know that Hamas knew that this vote had taken place, but you make a decision in the cabinet room, and then 6 people who were alive, who were waiting for you to bring them home, are murdered, and you find their bodies, and you were too late to get to them. I think it teaches us a number of things. First of all, a military operation and commando raids are not going to save all the hostages. It's just not possible. We're dealing with too many. Some of them are being protected and guarded at gunpoint. And as we saw with these 6, they were murdered before the Israeli soldiers could get to them. The second thing it also tells us is that time is running out for the hostages. And if we do want to get them back, the only real way to do that is to do a deal with Hamas. Now, the prime minister's decision, which he now has explained as of Monday night, gave a long press conference, and finally, for the first time, I would say, since this war began in the 11 months, explained to Israelis what it is that his strategy is to some extent. Now, we could agree with it, we could disagree with it, but at least he's finally spelled it out. And his strategy for now is we cannot leave the Philadelphia corridor. Now, we could say he's wrong, and there's a legitimate argument to make that he's wrong. We could say he's right, and there's a legitimate argument to say that he's right. But the importance of it is to finally say, this is my priority. I'm thinking longer term. I'm not thinking about the people I can save now. I'm thinking about the people who might be killed in the future. And these are tough decisions, because if you leave Philadelphia, you allow Iranian weapons back into Gaza. If you stay in Philadelphia, Hamas could say, we're not going to make a deal with you. And as of now, that's what they're saying. Now, they might change, but as of now, that's what they're saying. So you're basically bearing the chance for a deal, and it means you're sentencing, to some extent, the fate of the remaining hostages. Now, these are possible realities. And I think that Israelis today are torn. One poll that's taken by the think tank that I'm affiliated with, JPPI, shows that 50% of Israelis want the hostages back. 50% of Israelis want the Philadelphia corridor. Israel is split on this issue because it is so difficult and there is no clear answer. And I think that this is part of this ridiculous reality, this crazy reality that Israel finds itself in. And by the way, it speaks to the brilliance of what Hamas did on October 7th. They didn't just kill 1,200 Israelis, which itself was horrific. By taking so many hostages and keeping them in Gaza, what they've been able to do is continue to stab Israel's collective heart every single day, every single waking moment. And we're seeing how this is continuing, even 11 months into a war.
Of the tens of thousands of people on the streets of Tel Aviv and other places protesting, what is your sense in terms of the view that people protesting want a deal no matter what the cost?
Look, I think, well, no matter what the cost, it's a very tough term. What is a deal going to look like? We had in the beginning of this war, I remember specifically a former chief of staff of the IDF, who said we should release all the thousands of Palestinian prisoners in jail to get back our people. At the time, it seemed ridiculous to me. I still think that would itself be, release 6,000 security risks. I mean, there has to be some sort of borders to whatever deal is coming. But I do think also that most people feel that we do have to take calculated risks and some gambles with our security to get back these people. These people, let's remember, what was their crime? That they slept in their beds, in their homes, where they thought they were protected by the IDF, or soldiers who were deployed along the border and thought that the military would do whatever it would take to get them back, and that it was ready for this invasion, which it wasn't. So Israel as a country has a responsibility to bring them back. And let's also remember what happens if we do not bring them back. People talk about the risk to Israel in the future, but I also think of how do we convince young men and women to continue to serve in the military if they get this message that their lives are not important? How are we going to convince people to continue to live in this country, to be loyal citizens, to continue to sacrifice, to serve in the reserves as we know that we need, if they feel that they're just being neglected along the different borders that Israel has? And also, how will we ever heal as a nation if people still are in captivity by Hamas? So there's a lot of elements here, which makes it even more complicated. But I think that most Israelis, and polls also show, most Israelis are willing to make some gambles and some sacrifices for these hostages to come home. Israel is a society based on morals, values, principles, and ethics, some from Jewish tradition, and many also from the democratic values that we share around the world, countries and people who come from different democracies, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, and all across Europe. These are things that we just don't do and should never be done. We don't take revenge because it's the blood is boiling. We execute justice, as all countries should, after a due process and according to a rule of law. But we don't just execute people because of the fact that our enemies are doing that to us. God forbid we should become like them. And I think that Israel has shown throughout this war that we don't do that. We don't stoop to that level. We are not like them because, again, we sanctify life. We preserve more of them than they preserve of themselves. We protect more of their civilians than they protect their own civilians. We try to distinguish between when they're trying to get their civilians killed by using them as human shields, we're out there trying to protect them and prevent them from being killed. So that's a huge difference between us and them.
Whilst this is all going on, it feels that events in the north have been completely sidelined when a week ago it was the story in the Middle East, Israel's preemptive attempt to curb Hezbollah's massive attack on Tel Aviv and other key areas. What is the latest in terms of the ongoing tit-for-tat action with Hezbollah? Because the events of the last week have completely overshadowed what seemed like a major story.
That has fallen to the side. The issues of Iran and Hezbollah, it's true. First of all, there's the point that the news here evolves and moves so fast. And the challenges are so great and the threats are so dire. And you see this happening on a daily basis. One week it seemed like we're about to go to war in the north. The next week we're mourning and our hearts are bleeding and every Israeli's crying over the loss of these 6 hostages. There was a hope that they would come home. Those threats still remain. And let's remember that Hezbollah continues to attack Israel every single day. I was just up in northern Israel yesterday, right near the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, and up in near army bases. I mean, these are places that have been attacked every single day almost since October 8th when Hezbollah began its attacks. The US military presence is still in the region, and that's having an effect on deterring Iran from doing anything. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into believing that they have stopped. They still have their objective and their desire, which is to do everything they can to weaken Israel, to kill as many Israelis as possible, and to continue to solidify their control and their belt of fire around the state of Israel and around its borders.